So I've been to Greece a bunch of times as an MEP for various struggles and for previous elections. But you did get a sense, although I was only in Greece for a couple of nights this time round, that it was an historic moment, the election. The first left government in the course of the crisis, and potentially a big turning point for everybody across Europe. The idea that the ideological wall that says there is no alternative to austerity that has been dominant since the whole dominance of neoliberalism, Thatcherism, Reaganism, from the 80s really, late 80s and then 90s, 2000s, the collapse of Stalinism, the onslaught of the right ideologically, politically and economically, that there was no alternative. The idea that that wall has been breached by the Greek people electing a left government is very significant, and they open the way potentially for other people to go through that hole in the wall now. The idea that there is an alternative way to organise things, there's an alternative to austerity. So it is, you get a sense of it being a very significant moment for people. And I think already, like anybody who's watching what's happening will see that there's something different about this government. I mean, I'm not sure what the news programmes are like here, but this morning, Morning Ireland, which is your essential breakfast listening, the presenters were like, so it's now been a week after Syriza has been elected, and they still haven't given up on their pre-election promises. Just shocked. Because pre-election promises are meant to last up until the moment of the election and then quickly be ditched. So already it's a party and a people that are doing things differently, outside of how it's meant to be done, in terms of capitalist democracy, whereby you tell lies to get elected, and then you ditch them overnight. And so the most shocking thing is that they haven't given up on their election promises. But there's also many other things that are symbolic and are important in and of themselves. I mean, from the very first moment that Tsipras was elected, he refused to take the religious oath in a country that's dominated by the Orthodox Church, really, and he's an atheist, the first openly atheist Prime Minister, refused to take the religious oath, and then his first act as Prime Minister was go to the graves of anti-fascists in a country with obviously a strong far-right fascist party, Golden Dawn, but also a strong right inside New Democracy, almost far-right inside New Democracy, the main conservative party. They've sold or have put on sale the government BMWs. Varoufakis, the new finance minister, has been travelling around the world or around Europe to discuss with different finance ministers. And it is striking. I mean, he's going economy class. There's a picture of him in economy class with all the journalists surrounded around him. Or even, I mean, the picture of Osborne and Varoufakis, and just the contrast couldn't be more striking between bourgeois respectability, that's how politicians are meant to look, and Varoufakis with his casual style, no jacket, no tie, but also, if anybody saw, it was classic watching, was the press conference between Varoufakis and the head of the Eurogroup, Jeroen Dijsselbloem, who's this really neoliberal hawk. And so they had meetings all day, which I can imagine the type of meetings that they were, which is this kind of polite exchange of views, whereby he's like, well, you really have to implement austerity. And Varoufakis says, well, no, we were elected on this other programme, we're not going to implement austerity. So they go through this for a few hours, and then they have a press conference at the end. And again, they're just shocked, and the media is shocked by how Syriza is doing politics so far, which he's asked a direct question, are you going to deal with the Troika? And he answers the question directly, saying, no, we're not going to deal with the Troika, by which they mean the bureaucrats of the Troika who were sent to impose austerity, and what was known in Spain in particular, they're known as the Men in Black. In the south, we had A.J. Chopra, was the main man from the Troika, who would come and demand you need more cuts of this, less wages here, that they're refusing to deal with those people, that they'll deal with the IMF, the European Commission and the ECB as political entities, bilateral discussions between those, but they refuse to be dictated by the Troika. And so he announced this, and then they went to, your man Dijsselbloem was waiting for the translation to finish, and then he got up and basically walked off. And you can see there's a moment where he goes to give out to Varoufakis, and apparently what he said, he says, wow, you just killed the Troika. And Varoufakis like, and then your man walks off, and it really, it's done many things so far already in terms of raising people's hopes, a breath of hope all across Europe, the idea of something different. And one of the things that they've done actually is that they re-injected politics into the question of austerity. Because austerity is just meant to be the right thing to do. It's like there's a wrong way, there's a wrong, irresponsible way to conduct economic policy, which is like Keynesian, with like investment and stuff, or socialist if you're really mad, and there's a right, responsible way to conduct economic policy, which is to implement austerity, to take the necessary decisions regardless of what the people who vote for you want you to do. And they've re-injected politics by saying these things are political questions. We're not going to be dictated by neoliberal hawks who are economists and just accept their decision. Instead, we reflect an election that's taken place, and we will represent that opinion, discuss with others on a political basis. So just some of the things I want to kind of deal with is, one, how has this happened? How have we got to this stage finally, that you have a left-led government in Europe? What's likely to happen now, and extremely briefly, kind of what lessons for us, how can elements of what's happened in terms of Greece be replicated here? I think that in terms of how it's happened, a continent, like when I was politically, becoming politically active, and then for the first long period of my membership inside the Socialist Party, we discussed Latin America again and again and again, because there was like radicalization. There was not much happening in Europe, but there was massive radicalization happening in Latin America, and at that stage you had the beginnings of the election of like left governments in Latin America, Chavez in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia. People thought Lula in Brazil, although he turned out not to be left at all. But there's a real parallel, and the lessons. It's worth going back and studying again the history of Latin America up until now in the last 30 years, because the parallels are striking. Which was the use of Latin American countries as a test case for extreme neoliberalism. They didn't call it austerity then, they called it like Chicago School of Economics, extreme right-wing economics, liberalize everything, drive down wages, make your countries more competitive, destroyed societies, destroyed people's lives in Latin America, and provoked significant responses in terms of social movements like the water wars in Bolivia and elsewhere. Significant social movements in opposition to austerity policies, but also provoked, politicization of people, a push of people to the left, even in countries like Venezuela, where you didn't have a very, very strong tradition of the left or the workers' movement. And then the result of election of left figures like Chavez and Morales. And there's definite similarities. I mean, Greece it's the weak link of capitalism in Europe. It's an extremely weak capitalist country with an extremely weak, craven capitalist class, and not dissimilar to the really crap capitalist class we have in the south. And it became the most extreme test case of austerity in this crisis. So you had relatively high levels of debt, over 100% of GDP in the Greek economy, built up by an absence of tax paying by the Greek capitalist class, a policy of favouring the banks, favouring the bondholders over a period of time, and then demands that became very severe in the context of the Eurozone crisis, and then demands from Troika that will bail you out, but in exchange for this massive austerity programme. And the austerity programme was sold as dealing with the debt. But if you go back to 2007, the debt was 100% of GDP, which is a lot, but it's less than what we currently have in the south. The debt now in Greece, after a couple of restructurings and multiple bailouts, supposedly to bring the debt down. That was the pretext of the whole thing. The debt now in Greece is 175%. Right? So the whole aim of the Troika programme and the austerity programme in Greece was never actually to deal with the debt. It's like austerity is not actually meant to improve the economic situation. That they're policies to take advantage of a crisis that exists. It's a classic case of what Naomi Klein, when talking about Latin America, calls the shock doctrine. You use a crisis created by neoliberal capitalism to further embed that system, to go further in attacking workers' rights of indigenous people, rights of small farmers. That's exactly what has been happening in Greece. I mean, it's been happening elsewhere. It's been happening right across Europe, particularly in the periphery of Europe. But Greece is the really extreme case of where that has been happening. And what actually, the actual motivations behind the assault on people's living standards, the robbery of people in Greece that is called austerity, is one, on behalf of the Greek capitalist class, to drive down wages and conditions. and to have a process of what's called internal devaluation, so to make Greece more competitive by slashing wages in whatever way possible. So that means creating mass unemployment, 26% 26% unemployment now, 55% youth unemployment, incredible levels of unemployment beyond anything else anywhere in the EU. Cutting the minimum wage from €751 a month, which is already tiny in a country where, yes, things are cheaper than here, but perhaps like 2/3 of the price here. They're not half or less than half. So cutting the minimum wage from €751 to just over €500 a month. And succeeded in pushing down wages to such an extent that unit labour cost, so the cost to employ a worker to do a particular task, has basically fallen by 30% in Greece over the course of the crisis. And that's fundamentally what it was about from the point of view of the local Greek political and economic establishment, and from the point of view of the European capitalist class, and in particular finance capital, banks, bondholders who had bonds, who had invested, who had lent money to Greece effectively to get as much money back, irrespective of the impact in the long term in terms of the Greek economy or in terms of Greek society. So that's what they did. They implemented savage cuts. I remember before, when I was there, I was at an occupation of the social housing department, and where basically it was just closed down. Everybody was fired, and the social housing was just done away with. Like the equivalent of not just social housing, but also rent supplement. So just incredible savagery, massive privatizations, including the privatization of the equivalent of the BBC or RTE, which includes like not just one TV channel, multiple TV channels, multiple radio stations, an orchestra, a whole bunch of things that go with it, just shut down by the most recent government, destruction of the health service, destruction of the education service. And the result was like absolute devastation. And things are bad elsewhere in Europe. Things are very bad in Portugal. Things are very bad in Spain. Things are very bad in many, many parts of Europe, including on this island. But things in Greece are worse. It's not an exaggeration to talk about a humanitarian catastrophe within Greece. It's not an exaggeration to talk about a failed state within the European Union. Just profound levels of poverty. But half the population at or below the poverty line. So you've 26% of people unemployed, a large percentage of those. So if you're unemployed, you get dole of like €300 a month. But if you're unemployed for more than 12 months, or you're long-term unemployed, you lose that. So you get nothing. So like incredible poverty in a condition, like all social safety nets basically stripped away. With the result, there was a study came out recently, a massive rise in terms of suicide. They say an average an extra 11 people commit suicide a month than prior to the crisis, as a result of the crisis. That's directly responsible. You can put that at the door of the IMF, of New Democracy, and at PASOK. An explosion, like a quadrupling of homelessness, of every single social problem you can imagine. And it's not, as someone who, you just go into Greece, you just see it, like a level of societal dysfunction, whereby the basic things that hold society together in terms of healthcare, education, housing, those things gone. And really people's lives absolutely destroyed. The economy itself collapsed by over a quarter, collapsed by 27%. So a miserable situation for people, with which people responded, like in Latin America, with waves of struggle, including very, very significant struggles, over 30 general strikes over the course of the crisis. So waves of general strikes, of industrial struggle, also waves, which I was there at one stage when there was a wave of occupations taking place, with different public buildings that were being shut down, being occupied, and then at a later stage, ERT, the equivalent of the broadcaster, was occupied by the workers. So a tradition of occupations, people trying to keep things going, including in the private sector, people occupying workplaces, and then continuing to exist and operating in a kind of a social economy, whereby they occupied workplaces would trade goods with other occupied workplaces and then sell to consumers at knockdown prices, in order to provide people with what they need to have. And so in a bit of an outline, the outlines of an alternative model of running the economy. And then the other feature of the struggle was in the aftermath of the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, and then the spread throughout the northeast, the North Africa and the Middle East, in line with you remember the big squares movement, the Indignados in Spain, which then partly Podemos has grown out of in some sense. You had similar movements taking place in Greece, the Squares movement, whereby in the major capital cities, in some of the neighbourhoods, the suburbs, you had big occupations by predominantly more young people discussing politics, radicalised ideas, and also then re-inspiring the trade union movement and trade unionists to go back into the struggle and to engage again. So kind of different waves of struggle that ultimately brought down, in a sense, or had an impact in bringing down a whole series of governments, but then austerity kept being implemented. And so, like, to be honest, up until the recent election, a sense, generally speaking, of exhaustion of people, of having been through so many struggles, and yet austerity is still implemented. And it's difficult to struggle whenever, like, you have literally a struggle to survive for people, whenever the very basic things you have to struggle for. I mean, you have many cases of people who have like internally emigrated from the countryside to Athens, and Athens is like the really dominant city, then going back to their family homes or whatever in order literally to get access to food, because if you're a young person, if you're unemployed, if you're 12 months unemployed, you have no access to any resources or any social services or anything. Politically, you had, over a period of time, I mean, Greek politics was dominated, like, in Britain, Tories and Labour in the south, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, dominated by two parties: New Democracy, centre-right party; PASOK, traditionally centre-left, social democratic party. But in the course of the crisis, both of them were in power, including in power together. They were also brought down from the outside by the Troika, in particular the European Central Bank, it was 2011, and replaced by a technocratic government, a government of bankers ruling for bankers. And basically they were really, really exposed in the course of the crisis. That, like, when a crisis goes on a short amount of time, one of the two capitalist parties gets damaged, and then the other one comes in and is a clean pair of hands and looks as if it's something different. Whereas here, the crisis is so deep and so protracted that both parties were fundamentally damaged, but in particular PASOK, which traditionally would have gotten over 40% of every election after the 70s, after the fall of the dictatorship, and was devastated. So in the last election they got less than 5%. So they're completely discredited by their implementation of austerity again and again. So in that context of major struggles, people fighting back, the traditional parties being destroyed, massive political space opening up, that's in that context that the rise of Syriza took place. You don't have to go back that long for Syriza to be on like 5%, kind of up and then down again. Say at the European elections in 2009, they would have been slightly under 5%, as far as I know, and that was, the crisis was going on at that stage and would have stayed at that level for a while. Syriza comes from it, so it's an abbreviation for Coalition of the Radical Left. The biggest party within it is a party called Sinas Pismos that comes from the Communist Party tradition within Greece. There's also a Greek Communist Party that's to the left, but also more sectarian than Syriza, so that Syriza, like, it was connected to the struggles, as in its activists would have been active in the struggles, even if it wasn't directly leading kind of the movements that took place, and it became the vehicle of choice of the mass of workers in the context of the Greek Communist Party being a very sectarian party, PASOK completely selling people out, and then very, very quickly you had a rise of Syriza in the polls, whereby there was two elections in 2012. I think the first one was in May, where Syriza rose to 16.8%, getting much more than anyone expected. They hadn't, and then so much so that they weren't able to form a government afterwards. They had to call another election, which I think was in July or something. It was later on that year, where then Syriza got 26.9% of the vote, and they were challenging to win in that election. And I was there at that time, but New Democracy won and were able to cobble together a coalition with PASOK, their traditional enemies. But in the elections, it's worth noting that, like, say in that election, right, the big fear, and it was a big fear then of international capital, like the Financial Times, but also in Greece, big fear that Syriza would come to power and that Greece would be kicked out of the euro and the modernist project of the capitalist class in Greece would be disrupted by this anti-austerity force. And you had, like, an incredible campaign of fear by the media. I mean, the media is like a plaything of the oligarchs in Greece. You have a number of, like, shipping oligarchs in particular and all the media loses money, and there's like huge numbers of newspapers in Greece, huge number of radio stations, TV channels, etc. It's incredible for quite a small country, but they're all loss-making. Nobody makes any money out of it, but it's like a prestige project of rich elites to have, but also a way of influencing politics. And so very overtly political, biased newspapers in particular, and a massive campaign of fear against Syriza winning that election that did have an impact. The idea that, well, if Syriza win, then we'll be out of the euro, things will only get worse, etc., etc. So they managed in the last election to get the government elected. In the last European election, Syriza won the elections, and so it's been clear for quite a while that Syriza was potentially heading towards victory whenever a general election was held. And then the government collapsed in December because it was unable to re-elect a president. It's still a bit murky as to whether they knew that was going to happen and they deliberately collapsed the government thinking that they could still beat Syriza, or if it was an accident on behalf of the establishment parties. But regardless, an election was called. It was extremely short election took place, and there's a really good documentary that Paul Mason was involved in. Does anyone know the name of it? Anyway, Google Paul Mason documentary. Syriza. It documents the election campaign. That's very useful to watch. And the result was, well, what was interesting was the same campaign of fear. I mean, in the documentary, the Paul Mason documentary, they show and they translate the New Democracy TV ad, which is like, Syriza elected, Greece out of the euro, massive crisis, blah, blah, just like incredible fear. That's the only weapon that they had left, you know, and that's like increasingly the weapon of the capitalist classes and their media, like hangers-on, is this weapon of fear against hope. The same kind of thing has happened in the Scottish referendum. It happens in every referendum, but also in the elections when faced with the rise of radical or left forces. And so a massive campaign of fear, and it just didn't work this time. Because some people fell for the campaign of fear last time, and things didn't get any better, they got worse. And so now, like, the overwhelming feeling of people was that just things can't get any worse. They said this last time, and then they got in again, and things got worse and worse and worse, and things will keep getting worse under them. And so a sentiment and a momentum in the course of the election behind Syriza to put Syriza into power. It's interesting because, just to be entirely accurate, there is probably more enthusiasm for Syriza outside of Greece than inside Greece, whereby inside Greece the feeling of a lot of people is like they have to be better than that other lot, and if they do 10% of what they promise, well then that'll transform things from our point of view. But still a scepticism about Syriza, which is interesting and is actually a healthy sentiment for people to have, because it points to a maintenance of the movements from below, which is the key thing that can push Syriza beyond what it previously wanted to do. In terms of what the election programme that Syriza stood on, so it stood on an election programme that was watered down compared to the previous elections. An election programme called the Salonika programme, which is where the programme was devised. In particular, it was watered down on the question of the debt. So previously, they didn't have a position that they would just repudiate the debt, which is, say, what we argue for in Portugal and Ireland and Greece, that you come to power, you say, we're not paying this debt, it's not our debt. But they did have a position that they would seek a significant write-down of the debt, and including in that negotiation, play the card of a threat of debt repudiation in order to make themselves more acceptable, I think, but also in order to prepare for the fact that they were going to be in government and negotiating with these people. And they altered that demand quite significantly now for a call for a debt conference, which we obviously would also support, in which their proposal is basically that the European Central Bank would take the debt off people's hands, and then effectively the ECB would take an element of a loss from it, and no loss would be placed on any of the other bondholders. And also on the question of the euro, some of the demands were softened a bit, where the main slogan in the past was no sacrifices for the euro, because that was the slogan of the right: you have to vote for us, otherwise you'll be out of the euro. So in the past they said no sacrifices for the euro. Not that they didn't advocate leaving the euro, but they said we're not going to accept that we destroy people's lives in order to stay in the euro, whereas that was dropped and more of a kind of pro-euro position was adopted by the leadership of Syriza. And Syriza is a broad organisation with a left and a right, and a struggle inside Syriza over exactly what programme. But nonetheless, I mean, Syriza's programme, like, it's to the right of, like, Mitterrand's programme in France in the past. It's to the right of any kind of left social democratic government, including in Europe in the past, right, which would have stood for the nationalisation of significant parts of industry, etc. But, like, it doesn't take place in the same context. It takes place in the backdrop where everybody across Europe is for austerity. You know, the so-called social democrats and the Christian Democrats and the neoliberals, they're all for austerity. They're all for, and so a party standing outside of that consensus, standing for something different, is a very bright light in that context, and was that way for people. Just to give you an idea of some aspects of their programme. So the 7 immediate things they put forward, the main thing was posed as dealing with the humanitarian crisis, and because of this massive crisis that you have. And so an immediate plan for free electricity to 300,000 poorest households, free food allowance for 300,000 poorest household, free medical care and immediate lowering of the costs for medicines, an allowance for housing for 25,000 families, a Christmas bonus with 13th month pension for pensioners, bringing their pension up to €700 a month, free public transport for the unemployed and poor, and cancel the cuts on petrol allowance and heating allowance for the poorer sections of society. And they were kind of immediate demands that they stood for, but also an immediate reversal of the attacks on collective bargaining rights, the right of people to join trade unions, to organise themselves, a reversal of some of the privatisations, a tearing up of the privatisation programme, and abolition of there's a body that oversees and drives the privatisation programme, so the abolition of that, a reversal of the minimum wage cuts, the restoration of jobs to people in the public sector. And that's the programme in which they won the election. Obviously people know they won. I mean, they were the biggest party, got 36%. But they got 149 seats out of 300 in the parliament, which is obviously annoying, you know. And like, when we were there, so the exit polls came out, and if they'd gotten in the middle of the exit polls, they would have got like 151, 152. So there was a band of about 3%, but they got on the lowest end of the exit polls. The exit polls slightly overstated them, so there was like an element of disappointment amongst rank and file activists of Syriza, that because it was clear they had momentum going towards the election, and the biggest party often gains in support because people go for one of the two leading parties, Syriza and New Democracy in this case. But then they just fell short of the overall majority. They could have, and the numbers were there. I mean, the Greek Communist Party got 5.5%, and that would have been the ideal situation. The Greek Communist Party could have supported that government from the outside, could have allowed the government to be formed, and could have said, well, we support you every time you act in favour of workers, we'll vote in favour of that, and we'll vote against other things. The KKE, the Greek Communist Party, is like an extremely sectarian party, as in, you know, anti-other parties on the left, and they refuse to give any form of support whatsoever, even like a vote of toleration to allow the government to be formed. So that pushed Syriza into a situation where they did a coalition with the independent Greeks, in Greeks called ANEL, who are kind of a peculiar right populist element of UKIP, but anti-austerity, because that's what defines them. They broke from New Democracy to the right, but also to being more anti-austerity. So you know, dodgy, like bad on questions of immigration, on questions of gay rights. Like there's no gay marriage in Greece, and Syriza's programme is for gay marriage, independent Greeks is against it, etc. So it's problematic. They forced them into a coalition in order to be able to form a government. Syriza felt they had no choice but to form a government with the independent Greeks. The way like our sister party in Greece approaches that is to say that look, the independent Greeks are a trap. It's an unavoidable trap for now for Syriza, but don't be held back by what the independent Greeks say. Implement your full programme, do everything you're saying you're going to do for the workers, and then like force the independent Greeks to break from the government because they don't agree with your programme, and then go for another election, get an overall majority, and then have a more stable basis to go and implement your policies. Last couple of things. I think like the international media like kind of convinced itself that Syriza was just going to compromise just like that, you know? That it was going to be like Hollande in France in the last elections, that someone gets elected on vaguely anti-austerity rhetoric, gets elected, and then like just quickly forgotten. Whereas like it misreads what Syriza is. Syriza is not, you know, a social democratic or ex-social democratic party that is really a party of the elite, a party of the 1%. It's a different party with a different base amongst working class people, and it comes from a very, very different place. And so I think there was shock, because the whole thing was gearing up. They were preparing for a Syriza victory, but talking to themselves that it was going to be grand, that Syriza was going to be, adult and responsible and do the right thing, which is just a compromise on all their promises. And they've been surprised that Syriza so far has not done that. I mean, Syriza has announced a series of measures that break the Memorandum of Understanding, so the agreement that they have with the Troika. And some are quite symbolic and important. There's three major struggles happening at the moment in Greece, social movements. There's not a lot compared to what previously. So the three were the struggle of the cleaning workers, who were kicked out they were fired from and replaced by really low paid contract workers from the Department of Finance, and their symbol is the rubber glove, and so they've been camping outside the Department of Finance for a long period of time. There's a struggle of the ERT workers, which is the equivalent to the BBC or RTE, and there's a struggle of the people in Halkidiki, which is against the completely unsustainable, unsafe gold mining by a Canadian corporation called Eldorado Gold, and it's like a brutal struggle, a bit like Rossport on steroids. If anyone was down in Rossport in the past, in Rossport we faced loads of cops being brutal with people, but in Greece it's to the max, riot cops with really extreme offensive and brutality against people, and so far they've announced that the ERT will reopen, and that the workers will get their jobs back, and they've announced that all the public sector workers, including the cleaning workers who've been laid off, will get their jobs back. So it's quite an important symbol to the movements about what's going to happen. They've announced that they're going to increase the minimum wage to €751, so to restore the minimum wage. They have abolished the privatisation agency, and they've begun to reverse some privatisations that were ongoing, and they've begun to implement their immediate plan of action. And so, none of those are anti-capitalist measures in and of themselves, but for the Troika, they represent quite an assault, because they reverse the logic of the memorandum, and as in the austerity agreements, the so-called bailout agreements, because the logic is a logic of internal devaluation, driving down wages and conditions, making Greece more competitive at the expense of workers as opposed to at the expense of the elites. They've announced a plan of going after tax evasion. I mean, you have huge amounts of tax evasion in Greece, and sometimes right-wing politicians from outside Greece talk about tax evasion as if workers aren't paying their taxes. Of course, workers are paying their taxes. As a worker who gets a paycheck from an employer, your revenue, your tax is taken off before you get it. You're paying your taxes. It's the elites in Greece don't pay any taxes and have historically gotten away with not paying taxes. So they've announced a crackdown on all of that to try and pursue them and get the taxes off them. And so you do have a response now from internally inside Greece and from externally. You have already an economic attack on this government, in the sense you have a massive flight of capital. I mean, most of the money is already gone from Greek banks from a long time ago, from people thinking that the Greece would end up outside of the euro. But more money now is flooding out of the country, and Greek bonds have gone through the roof. So the cost, the cost for Greece to borrow money in the international markets has gone up now to record highs, because just international capitalism and local capitalism doesn't trust Greece, and you have a war of words with, for example, your man, the head of the Eurogroup, Jesselbloem, with Angela Merkel, with Mario Draghi, with them threatening all sorts of stuff. And so what it points to now is a period of confrontation between the Syriza government and between international capital as represented by the Troika, Mario Draghi, Juncker, Angela Merkel, these kind of people, as well as their own local capitalists, the oligarchs, who will be using the media against them non-stop. And we think that's important to have a sense of that, because sometimes, Varoufakis, who's very skilled in the media, and he's a different style if anybody watches him, but he uses the term, and if he's just using it in a skillful way, in a tactical way, then there can be a benefit to it. But he uses the term "our European partners," But people should be under no illusion. Angela Merkel is not a partner of Alexis Tsipras or of any ordinary person across Europe that there is a clash coming here, and the clash is inevitable. And the language of compromise and that we'll find a deal in the interests of everybody, etc., it hides the reality that there are irreconcilable interests here. The Troika, it's not an accident the Troika pursue the policies they pursue. It's not irrational from their point of view. It's rational from the point of view of, in particular, the banks and the bondholders in Europe who want to get as much money back as possible and to see wages and conditions driven down for Greece, and on the other hand the Syriza government that represents the interests of ordinary people. And so there is going to be, like, ultimately the choice is between compromise and ultimately sellout or confrontation at a high level. That doesn't mean that's going to take place like necessarily today or tomorrow, in my opinion. I mean, immediately you have a short-term issue that Greece may run out of money at the end of February, although I think probably they won't. A way will be found around that in order to push it all off, because it's in the interest of everyone to be pushed it off until June. But ultimately, there's going to be a very, very serious clash. And like that confrontation, it takes place in negotiating rooms. That's like a part of the conflict that takes place, like the class conflict fundamentally between the working class in Greece and in Europe and the 1%, the elite, the capitalist classes. It will take place in a number of negotiating rooms, but if it just takes place in negotiating rooms, well then, the 99% will lose. It's in the negotiating rooms whereby the 1% have their power, in the institutions, in the European Council, in the European Central Bank. They have an overwhelming majority on their side. And so, like, as socialists in part of Europe, we have to strategically see what's coming is this major conflict between two very different visions of how Europe should be structured, in whose interest it should be run. In terms of what's going to happen next, Greece can implement these domestic reforms, and I mean real reforms. Like, the word reforms has become a back to front word, where reform used to mean reforms in the interest of the mass of people. Now they mean the opposite. They mean counter reforms. But Greece can implement reforms domestically, and they do break the terms of the Troika agreement by doing so. And so that does threaten the rule of the Troika, and the Troika can say no. But ultimately, in order to have money to pay for it, they need some sort of deal on the debt, in all likelihood. And really the question is, like, does the Syriza leadership want to compromise? The answer is yes. And does Merkel and co, do they want to compromise? The answer is also yes. That doesn't mean they can agree to compromise, though. You know, there's many cases in the world of like two leaders not wanting to go to war but ending up going to war against each other. And the other factor is that, like, I think that personally there may be the grounds for a compromise between the Syriza leadership and the Troika, but I think there's not really a ground for compromise between the attitudes and the aspirations of the mass of people in Greece and the Troika. And that's the question of the pressure that's on Syriza government not to just do a compromise at the expense of their base and the consequences for them, because they are connected to their base. And for us, that's the key thing. And so we have a sister party in Greece, which is not the size of Syriza, but it's substantial enough in terms of the left. And we campaigned for and called for and actively participated in calling for a vote for Syriza, but arguing for the need for a socialist program to prepare people for what is coming. And so, like, the main emphasis now is on the movements. You know, so like something very positive. There's a rumour on the night of the election, which was that the ERT workers, the public broadcasting, were going to, on the night of the election, go and reoccupy their workplace and just restart the production. From the point of view knowing that now their government in some sense is in power and they wouldn't be able to move against them. Like, that didn't ultimately happen, but it illustrates like an understanding by the movements that you still have to mobilise from below. That's the key question. That's whether anything concessions are going to be given, is whether the movement comes from below. And there are positive symbols. Like, so for the movement in Halkidiki, is their attitude is, as long as the government stops bringing riot cops against us, we'll be able to win. We don't even need legislation. We can shut down the building of the gold mine. We can shut it down entirely if they don't use riot cops against us. Yesterday, there was a traditional anti-fascist demonstration. So there's a fascist mobilisation, which the fascists are obviously featured it very well in the elections, but I don't have time to go into it. There's a fascist mobilisation and a counter-fascist demonstration. And normally that would be baton charged, tear gassed by the cops. There was no cops there whatsoever. So the protests were about 10 times what it normally would be, and then the police didn't intervene at all. So a very successful demonstration by the anti-fascists. And that's what should happen, as in people should see this government can't in the same way act against them and should feel confident about mobilising from below. And then also in that way, and I'll finish up on these points, push for like a preparation of people for what's going to happen. Right? Because I think that is the one mistake, well, it's a major mistake that Syriza is potentially making, is that people are not being prepared for the scale of the conflict that's taking place, for the idea that there are irreconcilable forces coming to clash now, and that ultimately, if they don't get a deal that makes the debt sustainable, which I think is unlikely they get a deal that's good enough, well then they need to be able to play like the strong card that they have, which is to refuse to pay the debt, or at least to impose a moratorium on paying all debt, and institute debt audit commission, and refuse to pay all the odious debt. That's something that they could do, and they have a primary surplus, which means they get more in tax than they spend on public services. They only have a deficit because of paying the bondholders on a yearly basis, so they could do that. And that's a powerful card that they should be prepared to play, which at the moment they aren't saying that they are. But then they have to be prepared for the response, which is already being spoken about, which is Greek banks being starved of funding by the European Central Bank, which is a way of forcing them outside of the Eurozone. I mean, that's the logic of confrontation points in that direction, is that if you stand with people, if you really break from the logic of austerity, they're going to go all the way to try and crush you, to try and stop it being a powerful example for Spain, for Portugal, for Ireland, for everywhere else in Europe. And so then you have to prepare people for that. And again, that's not a disaster if you're prepared to establish a democratically controlled public central bank in Greece, but also to use your public the public ownership that currently exists, but bring it under democratic control of the banking institutions, of the financial institutions that already have ownership but not control over those things in Greece. Impose capital control, stop the capital leaving, and a vision of massive public investment, public ownership of the key sections of the economy to redevelop the economy on a fundamentally different basis. That's the logic of it. If they take this step, you take this step, in terms of if you consistently go in the interest of people. And that, in order for that to happen, we'll need a major movement from below. But also, and that's the last point on Greece, also, like, it's not around the corner, the question of like a military coup or something like that. But if the Greek government consistently acts against the interests of the oligarchs, well then the Golden Dawn elements in the police, I mean about 50% of police voted for Golden Dawn, the fascist party. Like, they won't forever just allow this to happen, allow power to slip from their hands. And like in Chile in the 70s, you'd have, or more recently in Venezuela against Chavez, or in many, like, international capital and local health won't just accept that their power democratically disappears. And so you have to have mobilization from below, but also from doing that, alternative structures of power, like local neighbourhood assemblies, workplace assemblies, etc., etc. And just the final point for us, sorry for going on so long, is what's the lessons for us in bullet points? One. The fact that there can be an alternative built, you know? That's a very powerful thing. The idea that you're not, you know, like when I became a socialist, it's just like a joke, you know what I mean? You're just this like marginal pursuit with no prospect of ever like changing anything, like, you know? Like, that's not the case anymore. And it's not just like in, you know, those Latin American countries that are mad politically, like, but actually in Europe, the idea of a left-wing force coming to power, challenging for power, that's a real thing, and that's a lesson. The idea that you could win, which I think is a powerful idea. Sometimes winning can be a vision of winning elections and winning government as opposed to winning power for the mass of people, and it could be like a reformist illusion. But the notion, it's not a wrong thing to the idea of people thinking about winning. That this isn't just a struggle to defeat this attack and that attack, but the idea of fundamentally changing society. It puts that on the agenda. And then the idea that, like, in and of itself, like, obviously, if everything in Greece went bad, and that's not impossible, you know, you could have a defeat, you could have a bad defeat in Greece, and that would create a negative situation where people would say, look, sure, we tried that, and it failed dramatically. But if it doesn't go that way, and it's in all of our interest that it doesn't, it opens up really a different scenario, because just the power of example, you know, the power of being able to look at somewhere in Europe and saying, there you go, there is an alternative, even though it's not like fully 100% the kind of alternative we want, but the idea that there is something, it just in and of itself, I think it is going to provoke a further radicalisation, a further shift to the left that is happening in most countries in Europe at the moment, and can propel more left parties forward. The idea of building significant left parties like Syriza, and also arguing for a socialist programme and fundamental revolutionary change. Obviously a good discussion, a lot of questions which I'll try and deal with. The nature of the questions kind of impose upon me the burden of being more critical of Syriza in terms of the kind of questions that people ask. So before I go into some criticisms that are made in a comradely fraternal way, you just underline the point of the election of Syriza being an overwhelming good, and that Syriza is a left party. It's not a traditional social democratic party that is no longer a party of the left. It's a party of the left, party of the workers' movement, and so it's part of a debate about, okay, what's the best way forward? And it's a debate that obviously primarily happens within Greece, and it's a substantial debate that happens within Syriza, but also within the Greek left as a whole, within the Greek social movements as a whole, but also obviously all of us have a stake in what happens in Greece. But that we have to, there's no point ever in just fooling yourselves into thinking that everything is perfect somewhere. You know what I mean? You have to deal with a situation, warts and all, be honest with yourselves and with everybody else you're discussing with in order to analyse things accurately. So just on some of the questions that relate to some of those things, I mean, say the question about NATO, it's one of the weaknesses of Syriza's programme this time around. Is previously they called for immediate exit from NATO, whereas it was left out of the programme for Syriza this time, and it's traditionally a very important part of Greek left programme because they're part of NATO and because they're in a strategic location for NATO, being at the edge of the Middle East, and it was an illustration of the leadership shifting, softening the programme in some respects. In terms of the structures within the party, I mean, there are problems in terms of the democratic structures within Syriza. So originally Syriza was an alliance of different forces, different left groups and individuals, and all parties had not quite equal rights, but all rights to representation at all the bodies. So at the Central Committee level, which is 100 and something people, which is the key leadership body inside the party. A couple of years ago, Syriza moved towards a party structure, so doing away with the different groups inside Syriza, saying you just have to be a member of Syriza. And a lot of people kind of around Europe thought, oh, brilliant, they're getting serious, they're preparing for power, etc. But what it was an element of was an element of the leadership of Syriza, or the right section of Syriza that would have an influence with the leadership that is of the centre, mostly, attempting to crack down on kind of internal dissent, or that overstates it, but on different left groups being active inside Syriza with their own ideas and having a freedom to move. And so you've had over a period of years, Syriza becoming less democratic internally. I mean, again, no question, it's still a million miles more democratic than the Labour Party or any of the establishment parties, where decisions are all made by parliamentary groups and not by the members. But over time, it's become less and less space for discussion. For example, there was a major controversy before the elections, whereby the leadership of Syriza proposed expanding the list of Syriza to the right, so including former members of PASOK and of Democratic Left, which is this other party, and there was a revolt in the Central Committee, which is the main body inside Syriza. People saying it's just too far, even of the main group that Tsipras is in is called Left Unity, which is the centre group, and then that split into left Unity and right left Unity, and a majority opposed the proposal of Tsipras and the leadership to kind of expand it to the right. But then they called a conference, and then the left backed down and just accepted it, and just increasingly you have less democratic control inside Syriza, in the sense of the Central Committee making the decisions. Instead, it's in the kind of leadership groups that the decisions are made. But it isn't just through formal democratic processes that the pressure will come to bear on the Syriza leadership. It'll come to bear from the mass of ordinary people, the social movements. You know what I mean? They're subject to pressures. The fact that actually they do have lives somewhat akin to the lives of ordinary people as opposed to politicians, etc. It makes a difference in terms of the fact of people are connected to a movement and can be put under pressure. In terms of say Latin America and stuff. I mean Latin America would be a reference point for Syriza. I know that Morales rang Tsipras on the night of the election, and I think that is a reference point, but it's also not like wholly just a positive reference point. There is a positive reference point, but also, I mean, there are limitations to Venezuela and to Bolivia because it's also a process that went so far but no further and is kind of teetering in quite an unstable balance whereby they've made inroads against capitalism. They've improved people's living standards substantially, but capitalism still has like a major force inside those societies, control of the media, control of the economy, and are able to attack those governments. And I mean, it's reasonably likely, I'd say, that Maduro would not win the next election in Venezuela, and you can have a reversal of the process and a coming to the power of the right. And I do think that's the vision, in terms of the central strategic vision of people like Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, and Tsipras and the people around Tsipras. Like, it obviously isn't a vision of going for socialism. It's something intermediate, whereby you go for something that is not quite socialism, but is better than the capitalism that we have, that establishes a foothold in a number of countries in Europe, and then can try and spread from there. And I think it underestimates like the extent of the aggressive opposition that they'll face, and the fact that capitalism in Europe really can't brook any kind of opposition and will bring all sorts of things down upon them. Primarily at this stage, economic, political, media, but that they will use those forces. And I think that's one of the features. And in terms of just the question of Russia, because I think it is interesting, like I have to say I enjoyed it when the Syriza foreign minister went to the European Council and he just like for a while didn't go along with it, you know, because like those European Council meetings are a joke, you know, they're dominated by the core countries in Europe. Supposedly everyone has a veto, supposedly they're unanimous, but like they all just go along with it. And whereas now things were going to be a bit different, and you see how Syriza can use Russia as a question of leverage, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that tactically in doing it, or even if you got cut off from funding from the EU and needed funding and you could get funding from Russia, nothing tactically wrong in doing that, or getting funding from wherever you can. But the question is, if Syriza adopted like a pro-Russian line, you know, it's correct to criticize the EU line on the Ukraine, which is an expansionist EU line, but you don't want to adopt a pro-Russian line, which is also an expansionist, imperialistic approach by Russia. And that's the point. If those tactical twists result in dropping your principles, like it did in terms of Chavez, actually, on international policy, Chavez was horrible, you know, whereby Chavez would support Ahmadinejad in Iran because Iran gave assistance, but like regardless of, you know, the lack of democracy, attack on human rights, attack on workers' rights within Iran. That's the kind of road that I think they definitely shouldn't go down in terms of relations with Russia and elsewhere. Just in terms of, the key question I think is what compromise, what's the basis for compromise? I think the outline of what they would like to be a compromise on the debt is clear enough, and it's a question of whether they get agreement around it, which is that from the point of view of Merkel, the ECB, etc., they cannot agree really to a write-down of the headline figures of the debt. They can't agree that the debt is cut because it's just the message is too bad. What they can agree to is some sort of lengthening of the terms or restructuring of the debt. And I think that's what they'll propose. And now, I mean, Varoufakis today, the finance minister, he proposed some sort of swap whereby they swap debts for other kind of bonds, etc., which is a version of restructuring of debt. There's the outline of agreement, or there's the outline of potential compromise on that question there. But I think it's extremely difficult to tell. I think it's extremely difficult to predict what's going to happen now because there's too many parts in play. Like even US capitalism has an interest here. And US capitalism is pressurizing European capitalism to try and go a little bit soft on Greece because they don't want someone leaving the Eurozone. You have the interest of the banks, the bondholders, all the different capitalist classes within Europe. You have the Greek government, and then you have the people themselves within Greece. So I think it's like really, really, it's one very, very difficult thing to predict exactly how it's going to play out. But I think like the bottom line, I think they'll have an agreement for 6 months of some sort, and then they'll get themselves to June, which is when the next big payments need to be made. And then I think you're going to see a more serious showdown, and in more of a definite way the choice will be faced with the government of like compromise in a significant way on their programme, get something but probably not enough from the point of view of ordinary people, or engage in an all-out conflict, which means mobilising people across Europe, putting pressure, etc. And a lot of that depends on the attitude of people. Because I actually think, like, the debt is very, very important, but the thing that I think isn't being taken into account enough by analysts looking at it is, like, really, can Merkel and Troy, can they really stand over, like, all the internal reforms being rolled back? Can they accept, like, the minimum wage being restored, wage levels rising, privatisation being reversed? Like, can they really stand over that? Because that's also a message to the rest of Europe. And I think it's there that most pressure, I mean, I think the average Greek person, if they got anything on the debt, they'd say, well, it's better than what we had before. But they can't accept that they just continue to live in misery and poverty. They have to get something. So I think it's there that you have the most potential for a big conflict on those questions. Just last 2 points, on the independent Greeks, I think given the position that Syriza leadership was in, they didn't have a whole load of choices. I mean, concretely speaking, they could have. There's a lot of talk of them forming a minority government, but it wasn't really an option for them. Concretely, they had a choice to go to an election, in which case, just the attitude of the mass of Greek people would have been, look, he came so close to power, and he didn't do it, they probably would have been punished and been pushed back. And so, in the situation that they actually found themselves in, they didn't have many choices. But they're the architects of that situation, because everybody knew they were going to do a deal with the independent Greeks, and the independent Greeks rose in the opinion polls because everybody knew they were going to do a deal with them. And so if they had gone on a campaign more explicitly from the start, going for a left government, pressure on the KKE, even when the KKE was saying, no, we don't want anything to do with it, and even in that situation, you could create a scenario of a lot of pressure on the KKE, which has like a mass base in society. It's significant. It's not a tiny organisation that can't be affected by things. I think like they got themselves to a situation whereby there wasn't much they could do apart from that. But if they'd set out a different project from the start, things could have been different. Extremely briefly on the Golden Dawn, like the Golden Dawn result is a scary result, because they got 6.9% in the last election. Since then, their members were implicated in the killing of Pavos Physos, who was a left-wing rapper. All their top leadership, their MPs, they're all in prison, and they're all implicated in the murder of a whole bunch of different immigrants, corruption, all sorts of stuff. So they're openly exposed as a fascist organisation. There's nobody in any question about that would have been in the last election. And in this election, they just dropped from 6.9 to 6.3%, the third biggest party. And so that's quite scary, where like over 1 in 20 people who vote are voting openly knowing for a fascist party. Obviously, the left combined is over 40%. So the weight is still on that. And the street strength of Golden Dawn in terms of like paramilitary type organisation that they have had is diminished because all their members are in prison because they have to be careful in a way that they weren't careful previously. But that's like if you're a Greek capitalist and you're looking for forces of counter-revolution, without trusting Golden Dawn, obviously, Golden Dawn are potential shock troops in terms of mobilising against the government in the future, and it's something that there isn't sufficient awareness of in the left. Last 2 points, 3 points, sorry. Question on the first past the post system. I think just one interesting point there, right, is obviously first past the post in Britain is designed to maintain like, stable two-party rule, but actually the Greek electoral system was designed to maintain the rule of the Conservatives or the Social Democrats. This system whereby if you come first, then you get a 50-seat bonus. And it's ironic that at a certain stage that turns against itself. It has an impact in terms of holding back the rise of the left, holding it back. But then at a certain point, Syriza wins the election and it has the result of producing a left government. And like at the moment in Scotland, where Labour is going to be wiped out of a system that's designed to make sure that Labour doesn't get wiped out and gets all the seats, is that at a certain stage, like electoral systems, they do have an impact, and like clearly in Britain, first past the post is a limiting factor in terms of people looking outside of the traditionals, but it only holds it back so far because the movement against the establishment parties, like in every country, eventually comes. And even in the opinion polls, the rise of the Green Party in Britain, I mean, it's a striking thing. Obviously, particularly in the South, we know the Green Party is like useless, will manage capitalism in a terrible way, and doesn't represent an alternative. But it does reflect the fact, like, yes, the rise of UKIP, but also even people are... So even though you have the first past the post system, still the potential for the left, the potential for Tusk is there as the situation develops. Last 2 points. One is just contagion is a very important notion here, and it sums up the fears of the establishment. Like, so one, a weapon that Greece has, and Syriza has, is that if Syriza is forced out of the Eurozone, the danger of contagion to other countries. The Eurozone crisis is back on in full force. Any other country can be gone. That's a weapon that they have in the negotiations and in the struggle. But the most important contagion is the question of political contagion. And that's what, like, the establishments in Europe have to weigh up political contagion versus economic contagion. And they may go for economic contagion over political, and so allow Greece to go out of the Eurozone in order to send a message. There's no easy lunches by electing radical governments here. But, like, you can see how, like, in Spain, because the things are connected, Podemos and Syriza, you can see, like, that protest that Kevin was talking about on Saturday, that's, like, profound to have a protest like that for a political movement. And if Syriza, if Syriza isn't defeated in a bad way, and there isn't a defeat in Greece in the next 6 months or whatever before the Spanish elections, clearly Syriza will be a major pole of attraction for people. The idea of an alternative is, like, extremely important, but also contagion, like, right across Europe. That notion, that's one of the most dangerous notions from the point of view of the establishment. Just the very last point that relates to that is the question of the water charges, because that's, like, one lesson of Spain and Greece is that you don't build left parties and left movements just on an electoral plane. They're built through movements on the ground. They're built through social movements, industrial movements, whatever, and then they find a political reflection, and the political reflection has to be consciously built. But it's not just some electoral project. Like, the reason Podemos is strong in Spain, say stronger than Izquierda Unida, is because they're more connected to the movements and seen as being flowing from the movements. And the same is the case in terms of Syriza, although not quite as organically as in Spain. And it's, I mean, in the south, you have this incredible movement against the water charges, which is beyond anything we've seen for decades, 3 decades. That you've had, like, the size of the protests, 100,000, 200,000 people, major movements. And we're heading towards now a key point where there can be, and I think will be, a major boycott of this water charge, which should be able to defeat the charge. We have to organise to make sure it happens. But, like, the movement has just transformed politics in the south. And so the protests, but above all the self-organisation. The fact that you have street meetings of hundreds of people in every local community, people coming together, experiencing their power, and it's transformed things. And like Daniel was saying in terms of the by-election, it's like, in that context of a movement, it's where the genuine left, based on movements, as opposed to, like, Sinn Féin in the south, tries to portray itself as like a parliamentary opposition to austerity. But when there's a movement actually taking place and people are struggling, well, then people look a lot closer at those things, and you don't get away with your parliamentary opposition anymore. It's exposed, and people see the reality of it because who was actually organising the struggle, calling for non-payment, mobilising in that way. And that's what's, like, in the south brings us closer to a Syriza type moment, really, is that the left, and, like, we're arguing that the anti-water charges movement, the activists should consider standing in the elections, that we should see if we could have a very significant left and anti-austerity, anti-water charges stand in the elections, and you could win 20 plus MPs potentially in the parliament, TDs, because of that movement. Without it, you wouldn't possibly have had it. And so we're not at the stage whereby you'll have a left government in the south, but you are at a stage where the Labour Party will be wiped out, where the Labour Party could be wiped out entirely out of Parliament. That was one of the things I tweeted on the night of the election, is that PASOK just snuck back in, so Ireland still can be, the south can still be the place where we completely wipe them out of Parliament entirely. That's possible, but it's likely that the genuine left will have more parliamentary representation than the Labour Party, and so you could have a strong left in the next Dáil in the context of Sinn Féin either being in government and implementing austerity in a skillful way, like they'll try to do, or in opposition and posing left. But having that left pole of attraction being extremely important in terms of how things develop, as is the case in Greece at the moment. And that's what we're trying to develop, is like a left pole of attraction involving the left of Syriza and forces to the left of Syriza arguing for mobilisation from below and arguing for fundamental change.
Thank you very much, Paul.